This is Tennessee Talks with United States Congressman Tim Burchett.
Hello, I'm Congressman Tim Burchett. Welcome back to Tennessee Talks. I'm happy to share with you this, our first episode of the Tennessee Talks podcast, the first video, excuse me. This show will continue to be available where you listen to your podcast, but you can now watch the show if that's what you prefer. New episodes can be watched on YouTube by visiting my official channel, which can be found by searching Congressman Tim Burchett. Please subscribe to our channel, and thank you all for listening. Our country continues to battle the opioid epidemic. Wherever opioid addiction goes, devastation seems to follow. Addiction causes folks to lose their jobs, lose money, lose their homes, lose their families, and most importantly and unfortunately, to lose their lives. We need to get this situation under control. In Congress, I introduced legislation that would give international fentanyl smugglers life sentences for their role in fueling the opioid epidemic here in America. Until we figure this out, it's important that those who are struggling with addiction have access to resources that can help them get back on their feet. I'm glad to be joined on today's show by someone who is in the middle of the fight against addiction. It's an honor to be joined by my good buddy, Cornerstone Recovery Executive Director, Webster Bailey. Webster, I can't thank you enough for being here. And let me ask you something, brother. Why did you enter this line of work?
Well, honestly, the short version is because of my own struggles with substance abuse. As a teenager, I started using, drugs and alcohol early, kind of in the late middle school, early high school years, and experienced a lot of struggle throughout all of high school, and then college at University of Tennessee. Continued to struggle, and then even into professional life after that. And so, at about 28 years old, I sort of found myself in a pretty difficult spot where I was hopelessly addicted to pain pills. I couldn't go 4 hours or more than 4 hours without using because I'd get sick. And so sort of found my own recovery at about 28 years old. And then honestly started volunteering at Cornerstone in the detox lounge, because I was working with some folks who told me, hey, if you want to keep this thing that you found in sobriety, you're going to have to start helping other people. And so I would come in and make coffee for a bunch of guys who were sitting around, going through withdrawals in a medical detox unit. And I fell in love with it, man. I fell in love with the guys and the recovery process. And I just sort of never left. And so my first role at Cornerstone was as a volunteer, and then it was as a counselor, and sort of worked around and have done about every job in the place. And I'm still here, 15 years later. So
right.
Yeah.
It's funny you say that. We have some mutual friends, and they tell me that is to continue their sobriety and to feel like they should be successful if that's what they do.
There's this old spiritual axiom that says, to keep what you've got, you got to give it away. And that's what this whole thing's about.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, what are some of the strategies that y'all have at Cornerstone of recovery that you use to help folks with substance abuse?
Well, there's a lot of strategies. I mean, to try to sum it up for the purposes of this podcast is, we use what we call a biopsychosocial spiritual model of treatment. So those are four main areas of a person's life: the biological side, which is sort of the medical side of what's going on; the psychological side, which is what's going on between our ears; the social side, which is what we do with our time and who we spend our time with. And then you've got the spiritual side. And so we really go at it at all four of those areas of somebody's life, and they're dependent on the situation and the individual. There's a number of different things that we do, but we've got to target all four of those things. So just for example, a lot of folks come into treatment because they started taking medication that was prescribed by a physician for a legitimate purpose, right? 5 years later, the injury's healed itself, but for whatever reason, they're still taking the medication. We've got to help them through that medical process, right? Or help them address the medical problem if it's not been fully rectified. So we're going to do that. And then dealing with all of the emotional fallout, because, this illness, it carries a lot of shame, guilt, remorse, hurt, anger, resentment, not just in the individual that we're treating as our patient, but in the family, friends, loved ones, coworkers, etc. So the whole world that individual is in is touched and affected by addiction. So we've got to dig into all that emotional turmoil, if you will. And then the social piece is we've got to help that individual look at their relationships and evaluate which relationships do I need to hang on to and which do I need to cut loose. And we've got to make some hard choices. And then the spiritual side is just what it sounds like, is we've got to help that individual identify something, a higher power, something greater than themselves that they can lean on, build relationship with, learn to trust, etc. So those are kind of the four key areas that we're going at within an individual.
Do you have a different strategy for somebody who's maybe trying to escape the bottle versus the opioids?
A little bit, yes. I mean, this may surprise you and others who hear it, but when someone walks in our door, I do care about what their drugs of choice are and what they've been using to get here. That's going to help us from the medical side,
right?
Safely help that person, detoxify their body from it. But when you get into the treatment aspect, alcoholism looks a lot like opioid addiction and everything else when it comes to the treatment side. Now, where there are some differences are what people have to do to get their drug. And so there's some lifestyle changes, and we have to address those differences in lifestyle or the rituals that come with it. So for an alcoholic, it's as simple as stopping by the gas station or the bar on the way home or whatever. Whereas for a drug addict who's having to buy stuff illegally, it's a little bit more involved, and you've got to have some different social relationships. You have some different behaviors. So that the addressing of that behavioral stuff is a little different, but ultimately the pain caused by addiction and the pain caused by alcoholism is much the same. And the turmoil that's created within a family unit is going to be the same a lot of times. And so there are some minute differences, but ultimately the way I look at it is anybody that's struggling is struggling with the disease of addiction, right? Maybe their drug of choice is alcohol, maybe it's cocaine, maybe it's opiates, maybe it's methamphetamine. But our common foe is the disease of addiction. That is the illness.
What do you think is the biggest challenge when somebody's trying to break the cycle or just get off of opioids that helps them to recover? Is there a single biggest challenge, or is it the individual person, or is it something that society's norms?
What we're dealing with is human behavior change, and that's the most difficult thing to do on the planet. You look at any chronic disease, whether it's addiction or diabetes or you fill in the blank, and the recovery from any one of those illnesses is going to be behavior change. And it's all about changing what we do, whether it's diet and exercise, or whether it's changing our people, places, things, all of those kind of, what we do with our time. And so what I was told early on in my own recovery process was, hey man, this is really simple, and you just have to change one thing, and that is everything. Yeah. Which was kind of mind-blowing, right? And terrifying all at the same, but change and dealing with the fear that comes with change, right? Because even though I was miserable, and most drug addicts are miserable in the position and the way that we're living, it's a familiar pain, right? And it's a pain that we've learned to live with, and that I've learned to cope with. I will tell you this, that recovery is much less difficult than living in active addiction. And that's contrary to what a lot of people think. When I give talks a lot, and when people, I'll say, tell me what y'all think about, what is recovery? And what I hear all the time from the audience is, it's a daily struggle. It's it's hard. It's a fight. And I tell them, it's actually not. For me, if I fight it, I'm doomed to failure. I've had to learn how to surrender. The way I look at it is my disease and my addiction and the drugs and alcohol I was using, that was like being in the ring with Mike Tyson, and they whipped me left and right, up and down, all over, knocked me down, had me up against the ropes. And at some point I realized I could step out of the ring.
Yeah,
I didn't have to fight anymore. I can live through this if I just get out of the ring. To imply that my recovery is a struggle or a fight implies me trying to dance in the ring with it again. And I choose not to. I'm outside the ring. I don't have to get in and fight anymore.
I got you. Well, let's change gears a little bit.
All right.
Fentanyl seems to be the hot button now. I remember when it was heroin, then brown tar heroin, and then now fentanyl. And what we're seeing a lot is that it's being cut. It's put into cocaine or pills. I sponsored this legislation. I got a call from a man in North Carolina, and his kid was on some antidepressants, and he went out on the street and bought the antidepressants the pusher or whatever gave him, and they were cut with fentanyl. And when they found him dead, the actual fentanyl pill was still in his mouth. It was just that strong. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that in our community, and is that something that because I hear nationwide really the terrible impact of fentanyl, where it's going, just the incredible. And you've heard the stories. What you could fit on a match head, you could kill 10 people with, and that kind of thing. And I believe it. I've talked to the officers, but go ahead.
Yeah. So, well, interestingly enough, I was just so here at Cornerstone on campus. I was walking across campus to get to my office to do this podcast with you. And there was a guy that I've seen the last couple of weeks. He's been here, and I saw him sitting outside on a bench, and he looked down, and I walked over. I walked past him. I said, "What's going on, man? How you doing?" And he looked at me, and he sort of shook his head. This is 20 minutes ago.
Right.
I said, "What's up?" He goes, "My buddy just died. I just found out." I said, "Oh man, that's terrible." And I sat down with him for a second, and I said, "Well, what happened?" He said, "Overdose." I said, "All right, tell me more." And I asked him. I said, "Do you think is it?" I said, "Man, when I got clean, so using oxys and all this stuff. I mean, there were some overdoses, but it was much different, 15 years ago." Sure. I said, "Do you think this is all the fentanyl stuff?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said to him, I said, "Is fentanyl everywhere like they talk about on the news?" I said, "You'd think I'd know that working in a drug treatment center, but you got to remember, in a treatment center, we're not worried too much about where you get your drugs and how you do it. We're talking about recovery stuff." And what he told me was, he said, pretty much anymore, that's all any of it is. There's fentanyl mixed in some way. He said it's in everything. He said very few people actually can even get legitimate prescriptions for Oxycontin, Percocet, those things. He said there's few prescriptions written for those anymore. So everything is pressed. Everything is, got some sort of mixture with fentanyl. And that's what he was buying. And that's what this guy knew he was buying, was fentanyl, was a fentanyl product.
Yeah. It's a bootleg pill. Yeah, basically, you say pressed. So people understand it's a pill. Like they think taking Valium or whatever. I don't know. I don't guess.
Yeah. It's just made,
what I mean?
It's pressed together like a pill is compressed. And, it's, these people are, whether it's in Mexico or, where, I mean, they're doing them in the US, they're doing them all over. So it's just it's a bootleg version that's made to look like the real McCoy. Right. So,
right. And they don't know any different. And
well, according to this guy who uses, he says, we all know that most of what we get now is pressed. It's not, it's not real, but that's just what you come to live with. Is that's the daily danger of it, is you don't know what the next one is going to bring you. So,
I visited y'all's facility. I think it was over in Louisville, maybe last February, I think. And I know y'all started taking Tricare, and you announced your new thing. And for our viewers and listeners, Tricare is the health care that our veterans are under. Matter of fact, my little girl, my wife is a widow, and I adopted her little girl, and her dad was a Navy man, and she's actually covered under Tricare.
Okay.
So, and I know you all are taking it on as for your recovery at Cornerstone. Is that system actually working? Have y'all had any success with that? And treating veterans since that's come into play?
Sure. Oh yeah, for sure. So, we've worked with veterans for a long time, but primarily through their other insurance. So, you take somebody who was a veteran in, say, Desert Storm or Shield, or, any of the conflicts, or, just a veteran of any sort, and they go on, they come back from service, and they go on to work at, whether it's Home Depot or American Airlines or whatever, right? And then they sort of become part of that system. And so we've worked with veterans for a long time, but the Tricare piece is what's new. And so getting in network with Tricare and being able to take active duty, current service men and women has been a big lift for us, just for our veterans program. So we've got some programming on campus that's specifically geared towards veterans. Not every veteran out there has seen conflict and not necessarily has trauma, but many of them do. And so we've been able to really dig into that and just sort of do a much better, more intentional job with it. So yeah, we're loving it, doing really well with it. Thank you.
Well, final question here is, what can we do in Congress that can be helping you? Locking up the drug dealers, I don't know how much that helps, because it just goes to the next one. Right. I don't know how you change people, people from, you always think of the junkie, or so to speak, as some guy or gal that's, grew up on the streets kind of thing. But, most of my buddies are in treatment, or been in treatment, or in 12-step or whatever, or grew up like you and I did.
Right.
We had meal on the table at night, we had mom and dad kind of thing. And so I'm wondering, what in Congress do you think we can do?
Well, so I try to keep this pretty simple, and this is really a supply and demand issue, right? When you're going after the dealers, and you're going after the border crisis, where so many drugs are flowing over the border, I think that's addressing the supply side of things, right? That's trying to minimize supply, but we also know, like you said, that we're in the middle of a game of whack-a-mole, the old video arcade game where you bop one head and another one pops up, and you just chase them around, and we can do that, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I think it's an important thing to try and stomp it out, but I also know that I think the most effective thing we can do is try to figure out ways to address the demand, right? I think there's at a community level, I think there's some things that we can do from a community level to reduce demand, right? And I think it starts with developing a curriculum for school age kids. It'll be controversial, right? I mean, how young is too young to warn people or educate people about the dangers of drug addiction, alcoholism, those kind of things. But beginning to educate folks, and education alone won't do it. It's got to be a multi-pronged approach, where we've got to get in. We've got to teach families how to be families. It gets back to the old core values of what American life looked like 100 years ago, right? I mean, those are the things that we've got to work back towards, and we can do that on a community level. We've got a new initiative here in Knoxville that I'm sure you're familiar with, called the Gateway Community Recovery Center. It's under construction right now, and it's not going to necessarily, there is a prevention wing to what it's doing, but it's more or less a boys and girls club for people in recovery. So it's when folks, if we can help curve the relapse rate. So when people find the recovery rooms or treatment centers, if we can help those folks not fall back into addiction again, to protect them or help them continue their sobriety, that's going to do a tremendous amount for our culture, for our society, for our city, for our communities. And so, we're trying to do that. I would look at, some of the things that a lot of people have fought really hard to take out of our schools probably need to be back in our schools, quite frankly. Whether it's God, whether it's, education about, emotional health and well-being, and knowing that it's okay to not be okay for a minute, life is not a Facebook post, life is not a TikTok, but learning how to live in the present moment and all those kind of things. And I could talk about that forever, but it's getting back to the basics of what American life has been about for 100 years,
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And we're going to have to wrap it up. I would say this, I was pretty fortunate in life. I had two very, very cool, God-fearing parents. And I can remember I had some surgery one time and they put me on, I think it was morphine back then. And I remembered I went on it for a long time because of the surgery. It was really painful. And then they took me off on my birthday. And I remembered my Sunday school class was visiting that day, came to the hospital to visit me. And I was a young man, but I think I was in college. And I was literally I was about to climb the walls. And they took me off that morphine, not the pain, but just the mental. It was, and then I realized, that it's very, at that time, I guess I was early stages of addiction because of the amount that they put me on, and different people react differently, and I had, a while back, I had pneumonia and I was in intensive care. And then when I got out, they gave me those big opioids. I forget which oxys, I guess they were. And I just wouldn't take them. I took Advil or aspirin because I knew that, there go I by the grace of God. I know that was, that's the gateway. I'd seen too many of my buddies and, they were stronger willed and more educated and prettier than I was that got hooked up on that junk. And it's just so easy to happen. So I really thank you so much.
Sure. So let me jump in and say this. So what you were feeling, just because I want to put some clarity around that. So what you were feeling was actually the beginnings of chemical dependency. And so chemical dependency and addiction are two different things, right? So here's the way I explain it in layman's terms is chemical dependency is when you develop that where your body has to have it, right? You've taken it regularly enough to where your body recognizes, hey, we're getting this chemical. We don't need to produce it anymore. We can shut that factory down. And then when you stop taking it, your body kind of goes haywire. And that's what you were describing. Addiction is when you use a chemical, have negative consequences associated with that use, whether it's alcohol or drugs or whatever, and decide to do it again, right? Like when I drink, I get into fights. And I'm going to go out and drink again or whatever it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That insanity of it, that's the addiction piece. Whereas chemical dependency is, like the situation you described or the situation, take a grandmother, right? Takes hydrocodone every day for her back. Well, if grandma goes into, if her prescription gets stopped or she can't get a refill, she's going to go into the same withdrawal that a heroin addict down under Gay Street Bridge is going to go under because the body doesn't know the difference. It's the same. So that's the chemical dependency versus addiction piece. But anyway, I love talking about this stuff, man. I appreciate you having me on.
Brother, I thank you. And I appreciate you coming on today and discussing this important work that y'all do over at Cornerstone. And it's not in my notes, but I would tell folks that are listening, if you need help, reach out to me or somebody, get hold of Webster over at Cornerstone and we'll try to hook you up and get you where you need to go. Like I say, there go I with the grace of God. I have no judgment. Some of my best friends in the world have been there, and by the grace of God, they're out and they're success stories. So it is possible, and then they're at the top of their field. So thank you so much, Webster. And I wanted to thank y'all so much for joining me for this episode of Tennessee Talks. I'm Congressman Tim Burchett. Thank y'all.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Tennessee Talks. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Keep up with Congressman Burchett by following @Rep Tim Burchett on Twitter and Instagram and @Congressman Tim Burchett on Facebook and YouTube.